call me a son of a bitch again, you...
Before CGI, before safety regulations anyone actually followed, before the MPAA figured out what to do with a Lamberto Bava film on a Friday night. The 1980s produced 8 horror films that the decade's censorship apparatus was still writing new rules to address by the time the films had already found their audience. Tonight we go through all of them. And the last one on this list was directed by a man who had spent his entire career playing the monster, not making the movie.
Now we're going to have every aquara in the territory down on our backs.
Oh, John! Oh, God!
Massacre in Dinosaur Valley, 1985, directed by Massimo Tarantini. Nobody surviving a plane crash in the Amazon jungle expected to also have to deal with slave traders, piranha, and a Vietnam veteran with unresolved issues. And yet here we are. Massimo Tarantini made Massacre in Dinosaur Valley for a Brazilian-Italian co-production company with Michael Etienne Sopkiw in the lead role and the specific formal ambition of a filmmaker who had decided that the jungle survival format and the exploitation format were the same format with different location requirements. The film arrived in the American VHS market through the distribution channels that were moving Italian-Brazilian co-productions through rental stores in 1985, where the box art, which featured imagery suggesting a more dinosaur-centric narrative than the finished film delivered, generated the specific customer response of people who had rented something, expecting one thing, and received something completely different, and found the something completely different more interesting than the thing they had expected. Sopkiw plays Professor Michael Banning with the physical competence of an actor whose career had been built in Italian genre productions and who brought to the Amazon sequences a specific quality of credible discomfort. Not acting at being hot and muddy, but actually being hot and muddy on a Brazilian location that the production had not overmanaged. The piranha attack sequence, the slave trader subplot, and the Vietnam veterans' specific psychological damage are presented with the cheerful procedural efficiency of a production that understood its audience had not rented Massacre in Dinosaur Valley for narrative sophistication. The scene in which a character is dispatched by piranha in a river crossing that the group had been explicitly warned about is the film's formal statement about the relationship between information and survival in the Italian exploitation format. The information is provided. The character ignores it. The piranha confirm the information's relevance. This is not a plot hole. It is the genre's entire moral framework operating at full efficiency. Massacre in Dinosaur Valley has been released through Severin Films. Michael Sopkiw made 4 Italian genre films between 1983 and 1986, and then retired from acting entirely to become a chiropractor in Connecticut. A career transition that the Italian genre film industry of the mid-1980s produced with a frequency that suggests the industry was generating more chiropractors than it was generating stars. Massacre in Dinosaur Valley put its characters in the Amazon and let the jungle do the work. Slaughterhouse put its characters in an American meat processing facility, and discovered that the specific horror of industrial food production required no jungle, no piranha, and no co-production deal with Brazil to be genuinely disturbing.
Boy, Buddy's not just another pretty face. Some say he reeks of class. Others say he just reeks.
This little piggy has roast beef. This little piggy has none.
This little pig ran wee all the way home. Buddy's a good boy, but he has what you might call basic hygiene problems. Sometimes Buddy likes to mess around. And sometimes kids play in Buddy's slaughterhouse. And they make fun of Buddy. But Buddy likes to play with his friends. Let me go, fat boy! But don't mess with his hogs. Buddy, he's going hog wild at the...
Slaughterhouse 1987, directed by Rick Roessler. A condemned slaughterhouse on the American rural landscape is scheduled for demolition, and the former owner's son, a large man named Buddy who communicates exclusively through pig-like vocalizations and a meat cleaver, has opinions about the demolition that he expresses directly. Rick Roessler made Slaughterhouse for American artists with a production budget that the finished film's single primary location reflects as the area where the entire creative investment was concentrated, an actual decommissioned slaughterhouse in rural Washington state, whose physical environment the horror premise required, and that no studio construction could have replicated. The film belongs to the specific cycle of rural American slasher films that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre had established as a commercial category, and that the 1980s drive-in circuit had been reproducing with varying degrees of success for a decade. But Roessler's approach was more formally grounded than the cycle's more generic entries, the actual slaughterhouse providing a physical texture that the practical effects team's work with the facility's existing equipment had amplified rather than manufactured. Joe B. Barton plays Buddy with the physical commitment of a performer, whose role required him to spend the production's entire shooting schedule in an actual decommissioned slaughterhouse, expressing his sounds that the sound design team subsequently enhanced in post-production. The rural Washington setting, shot in actual agricultural landscape, with the production's documentary attention to the specific texture of an American rural community, watching its industrial infrastructure be dismantled by economic forces beyond its control, gives the film a geographic specificity that the slasher format had not consistently delivered. The meat hook sequence, Buddy applying the slaughterhouse's existing equipment to a purpose its manufacturers had not intended, is the film's practical effects achievement and the scene most cited by the VHS rental audience as the one that established Slaughterhouse's specific register as something the slasher format's conventional suburban settings had not previously permitted. Slaughterhouse has been released through Lionsgate. Rick Roessler made no further horror films. The actual slaughterhouse where the film was shot has been demolished. Buddy's specific vocal approach has been discussed by the film's cult following as the most committed performance in a film that had no budget for performance coaching. Slaughterhouse used an actual industrial facility as its horror environment. Body Count used the Italian countryside and Ruggero Deodato, the director of Cannibal Holocaust, to produce a film that the American slasher format's conventions could not have generated because the American slasher format had not been designed to accommodate a filmmaker whose relationship to the audience's comfort was fundamentally adversarial.
It's right in the middle of nowhere.
Where the young come to play and to party.
I guarantee you this is gonna be a weekend you'll never forget.
Campers.
It's like a minefield.
What'd you set all these traps around the house for?
Because I'm gonna get him.
Now, by the way, there's a lot of kids around here. Anything happens to them,
I'm gonna hold you responsible.
See how you do it, Tracy?
If I missed, you know you don't have to swallow, sissy.
In these woods,
This was no accident, Ted.
Tell us about the murder again. What? Stay away! Come any closer!
Body Count 1986, directed by Ruggero Deodato. A group of teenagers camping near a Native American sacred site in rural Italy begin dying at the hands of a shaman whose specific grievance the film establishes in its opening sequence, and whose methods of addressing it the film documents across its runtime with the procedural efficiency of a director who had made Cannibal Holocaust 6 years earlier and had not become more reassuring in the intervening period. Ruggero Deodato made Body Count for Dania Film with a cast that included David Hess. The actor whose performance in Last House on the Left had established him as the decade's most unsettling screen presence, in a role that the film deploys with the specific intelligence of a director who understood that casting Hess was itself a formal statement about what the audience should expect. The Italian-American co-production arrangement that financed the film provided access to Italian countryside, locations that the American slasher format's conventional suburban settings had not explored, and the Native American sacred site premise, however culturally inexact the film's deployment of it was, gave the horror a geographic and spiritual specificity that the masked killer in the woods format rarely achieved. The kill sequences, designed by the production's practical effects team with the specific ambition of exceeding the Italian genre market's established content baseline, achieve a physical explicitness that the American MPAA review process had required cuts to address before the film could receive domestic distribution. The cuts were made. The cut material was restored in the home video version that the rental market received the following year. The tent sequence, 2 characters, 1 shaman, and a specific practical effects achievement that the production's team constructed from materials whose combination Deodato has declined to describe in detail in any subsequent interview, was the scene most cited by the VHS audience as the formal achievement that separated Body Count from the slasher cycle it was superficially operating within. Body Count has been released through Severin Films in a restoration. Ruggero Deodato continued making films through the 1990s. David Hess died in 2011. The Italian countryside locations are accessible. The Native American sacred site the film depicts does not correspond to any actual historical location. Body Count used Ruggero Deodato and David Hess as its primary horror instruments. A Blade in the Dark used a villa, a swimming pool, and the specific formal intelligence of a filmmaker who had grown up watching his father Mario Bava invent the Italian horror genre, and had decided that the most disturbing version of the giallo was the one that happened in a space so ordinary that the ordinariness was the horror.
Linda?
A Blade in the Dark, 1983, directed by Lamberto Bava. A film composer named Bruno rents a remote villa to work on the score for a horror film, and the villa's previous tenant has left something behind that the film takes its time identifying while Bruno composes music for a movie about the specific fear that the film he is currently inside is producing in real time. Lamberto Bava made A Blade in the Dark for Italian television as a 4-part miniseries before it was re-edited into a theatrical feature for international distribution. A production history that the finished film's pacing reflects as an asset rather than a liability. The television format's extended character development, giving the horror sequences a foundation of domestic familiarity that the theatrical slasher format's compressed timeline could not have constructed. Andrea Occhipinti plays Bruno with the specific quality of a man whose professional relationship to horror. He is literally scoring a horror film while horror is occurring around him. The film uses as its central formal irony without underlining it so heavily that the audience cannot discover it independently. The villa setting, shot in an actual Italian property with the production design team's minimal intervention, gives the film a physical environment that Lamberto had learned from his father to treat as a character rather than as a backdrop. The kill sequences, achieved with practical effects that the production's television budget had constrained and that the theatrical release's marketing had been built around, were the content that the Italian censorship board had required cuts to before domestic broadcast. Cuts that the theatrical version restored and the international version presented without the board's modifications. The bathroom sequence, a kill achieved through the specific combination of practical effects and camera positioning that Lamberto had been developing across his early career, and that this film deployed for the first time at the scale the material required, was the scene most cited by the Italian theatrical audience as the formal achievement that established A Blade in the Dark as something that the giallo format's established grammar had not previously delivered in this specific domestic register. A Blade in the Dark has been released through Arrow Films in a restoration. Lamberto Bava continued making horror films through the 1990s. The villa where the film was shot is a private residence. The horror film Bruno is scoring within the film has never been identified as corresponding to any actual production. A Blade in the Dark made its horror domestic and patient. Zombie 3 made its horror immediate and chaotic, and the specific chaos was not entirely intentional, produced by the specific circumstances of a production that had 2 directors, neither of whom finished the film they had started. Zombie 3, 1988, directed by Lucio Fulci and Bruno Mattei. A military experiment with a reanimation serum goes wrong in a tropical location. The zombie population expands faster than the military's containment strategy can address, and a group of soldiers and civilians attempt to reach safety across a landscape that the production's Filipino locations had provided without charge, and that 2 separate directors had filmed in 2 separate registers that the editing could not entirely reconcile. Lucio Fulci began Zombie 3 for Flora Film in the Philippines and completed approximately 60% of the production before illness required him to leave the shoot, at which point Bruno Mattei, who had made Rats, Night of Terror and Zombie Creeping Flesh, and approximately 40 other films in the Italian exploitation market, was brought in to complete the remaining 40%. The finished film is the product of this specific production circumstance and the editing strategy that the producers assembled from the 2 directors' disparate footage. Fulci's sequences operating in the atmospheric register of the Gates of Hell trilogy, and Mattei's sequences operating in the high-velocity action register of his own filmography, the 2 registers alternating across the runtime with the specific tonal discontinuity of a film that knows it has 2 directors and has decided that acknowledging this through the editing is more honest than pretending otherwise. The Filipino location work, shot in actual tropical terrain, with a cast that included several American actors whose presence the international distribution deal had required, gives the zombie sequences a geographic specificity that the Italian studio had not been able to provide, and that the production's compressed schedule had made the primary visual resource. The refrigerator sequence, a zombie emerging from a hotel refrigerator with the specific practical effects, work that Matte's completion unit had constructed for the scene, and that the film's cult following has cited as the image that most clearly demonstrates the tonal gap between the two directors' approaches, is the moment most discussed by the VHS audience as the point where Zombie 3 revealed exactly what kind of film it was, which is a film made by two people who were not in the same country at the same time, and whose work the producers had assembled into a single runtime through the specific optimism of people who believed editing could solve problems that the production itself had not resolved. Zombie 3 has been released through Severin Films in a restoration. Lucio Fulci died in 1996. Bruno Mattei continued making films until his death in 2007. The Filipino locations are accessible. The reanimation serum depicted in the film has not been officially synthesized. Zombie 3 was a film with two directors who never occupied the same location simultaneously. Demons 2 was a film with one director who had decided that the first Demons had established a formal approach worth repeating at higher volume, and with a television set replacing the movie screen as the portal through which the horror entered the audience's domestic space. Demons 2, 1986, directed by Lamberto Bava. The residents of a modern apartment building are watching a television broadcast of a horror film about demons when one of the film's demons crosses through the television screen into the apartment of a teenage girl celebrating her birthday. And Lamberto Bava made this for Dario Argento's production company with the specific understanding that the first Demons had established a commercial formula, and that the second film's obligation was to deliver that formula with new characters, and the same practical effects budget, and the same practical effects. Lamberto Bava shot Demons 2 in Rome with a cast that included Asia Argento in one of her earliest screen appearances, her father Dario's casting decision giving the production a biographical dimension that the horror sequences required the audience to process alongside the film's formal content. The apartment building setting, constructed on a Rome soundstage, with a production design that prioritized the specific texture of 1980s Italian middle-class domestic architecture, provides the film with a horror environment that the first Demons cinema setting had established as conceptually rich and that the domestic setting amplified. The television set replacing the movie screen as the portal through which the Demons entered. A formal update that Lamberto made with the specific awareness that his audience in 1986 was more likely to encounter horror through a television screen than through a theatrical one. The practical effects work, executed by the same team that had made Demons with the same budget and the same ambition, achieves a consistency with the first film that the sequel format required, and a specific escalation in several sequences that the first film's commercial success had provided the financial justification to attempt. The swimming pool sequence. A demon emerging from the building's basement pool in the film's third act. The practical effects work that the production's team constructed for the sequence's extended duration was the scene most cited by the Italian theatrical audience as the formal achievement that established Demons 2 as something more than a repetition of the first film's formula. Demons 2 has been released through Synapse Films in a restoration. Lamberto Bava made Demons 3 in 1989. Asia Argento has discussed her early appearances in her father's productions extensively in subsequent interviews. The Rome soundstage, where the apartment building was constructed, has been demolished. The television set through which the Demons entered has not been officially located.
If you will, an exhibit in fear.
It looks a little spooky, boys. Do you think we should do this?
Of unearthly elements of the supernatural. Look.
Now this is killer.
Enjoy best and darkest fantasies.
Ooh, scary.
Wow, the glasses from Nutty Zombies from Hell.
Lose yourself. Don't step over the rope.
Welcome, my dear.
Bravo!
What the hell did you kill him for? He'd have been perfect!
Waxwork 1988, directed by Anthony Hickox. A group of college students accepts a midnight invitation to a wax museum whose displays a vampire's castle, a werewolf's forest, a mummy's tomb, a zombie plantation turn out to be portals into actual versions of the scenarios they depict, and the students who step inside the displays discover that the exit is not where the entrance was. Anthony Hickox made Waxwork for Vestron Pictures with a production budget that the finished film's practical effects ambition consistently outpaced, a circumstance that the effects team addressed through the specific creativity of people who understood that the audience's imagination was the most reliable effects resource available, and that withholding was sometimes more effective than showing. The film belongs to the specific cycle of late 1980s horror comedies that had been developing since An American Werewolf in London established that the genre's conventions could be simultaneously honored and subverted. But Hickox's approach was more encyclopedic than most of the cycle's entries, the wax museum format providing a structural justification for moving through multiple horror subgenres within a single film without the tonal inconsistency that the movement would otherwise have produced. Zach Galligan plays Mark, the student whose investigation of the museum drives the film's second act with the specific quality of an actor whose previous horror credit, Gremlins, had established a specific audience expectation that Waxwork deployed as a misdirection device. David Warner plays the museum's owner with the theatrical authority of an actor who had been delivering exactly this quality of villain performance since the early 1970s, and who understood that the role's requirements were not dramatically complex, but atmospherically precise. The Marquis de Sade sequence, one of the Wax Museum's displays, the specific practical effects work that the productions team constructed for the segment's extended duration, and the specific tonal register that Hickox maintained across a sequence whose content the MPAA had required modifications to before issuing an R rating, was the scene most cited by the 1988 theatrical audience as the formal achievement that established Waxwork as something the horror comedy format had not previously attempted with this degree of genre literacy. Waxwork has been released through Lionsgate in a restoration. Anthony Hickox made Waxwork 2, Lost in Time in 1992, and has continued directing in the genre market. Zach Galligan appeared in both Waxwork films. David Warner continued working in horror until his death in 2022. The Wax Museum set was constructed on a Los Angeles soundstage and demolished after production. The portal mechanism has not been officially explained. Waxwork put every horror genre inside a single building and invited the audience to walk through all of them. 976 Evil put a single horror concept inside a telephone number and gave it to a teenager who had been waiting his entire life for something to make him feel powerful. And Robert Englund directed this with the specific understanding of a man who had spent 5 years playing the monster and had learned more about horror from that position than any film school curriculum had been designed to teach.
From the mind of Robert Englund, alias Freddy Krueger, innocent.
Someday soon, you're gonna be down here and I'm gonna spit on you.
Warning from God.
Warning about what?
Directorial movie.
What's up, Chuck?
A movie reliving a nightmare.
Let him go!
The powers of darkness have returned.
I'm ready.
Take it.
You're too late, Palmer.
Angela!
976 Evil, 1988, directed by Robert Englund. Hoax is a teenager living with his religious fanatic aunt and his popular cousin Spike. And when Hoax discovers a telephone horoscope service called 976 Evil that provides its callers with increasingly specific supernatural assistance in exchange for their soul. The transaction produces consequences that the film documents with the specific formal intelligence of a first-time director who had been observing horror filmmaking from the actor's position for a decade and had assembled a comprehensive understanding of what worked and why. Robert Englund made 976 Evil for Cinetel Films as his directorial debut, a circumstance whose commercial logic was transparent. Englund's association with Freddy Krueger having established him as a bankable name in the horror market, regardless of which side of the camera he was operating from. Stephen Jeffries plays Hoax with the specific quality of a performance built around the transformation from victimhood to power. A teenager whose social marginalization the film establishes with the procedural patience of a director who understood that the horror of the supernatural transaction required the audience to understand exactly what Hoax was exchanging his soul for, and why the exchange felt, to Hoax, like a reasonable arrangement. Jim Metzler plays Spike with the casual authority of the popular cousin whose social ease the film deploys as a contrast to Hoax's desperation, a character whose function is to establish the social hierarchy that the supernatural transaction will invert. Englund shot the film in Los Angeles with a practical effects team whose work on the transformation sequences demonstrates the specific knowledge of what practical horror effects were capable of that his years on the Nightmare on Elm Street sets had provided him. The fish sequence, Hoax's supernatural abilities deployed against a bully in the film's second act, the specific practical effects achievement that the production's team constructed for a scene whose tonal register is simultaneously comic and genuinely disturbing, was the scene most cited by the 1988 VHS audience as the moment 976 Evil established its specific formal register as something that the Nightmare on Elm Street cycle had been building toward without arriving at. 976 Evil has been released through Vestron Video in a restoration. Robert Englund returned to acting following the production and has not directed another film. Stephen Jeffries subsequently left acting entirely. The 976 telephone number format that the film's premise deployed was a real premium rate service infrastructure that the American telecommunications industry had developed in the mid-1980s, and that the FCC subsequently regulated more stringently following consumer complaints about unauthorized charges. The supernatural assistance the number provided has not been officially documented by any telecommunications regulatory body. Films from a decade that produced more horror per dollar spent than any decade before or since, because the dollar amounts were small enough that the people spending them had no institutional framework telling them what horror was allowed to look like. The practical effects teams on every film in tonight's list built things that CGI has since replaced, and that the replacements have not improved on. Which of these 8 sent you to a video store at 10 o'clock on a Friday night? Leave the specific film and the specific aisle in the comments. Like if any of this felt like a memory, subscribe. Next time we go further into the decade's horror output, to the films that the major studios made, regretted immediately, and spent the following decade pretending they hadn't.